Good morning. Welcome to Three Rivers Baptist Church in Irmo, South Carolina, and to our Sunday School hour. Happy Mother's Day to all you mothers out there and to everybody who's got a mother. Today we are in 2 Samuel chapter 21. We're getting into the home stretch here in our study in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel from the Old Testament. And before we dig into the passage, let me pray for us. Our Heavenly Father, we come to you because you have made a way for us to come to you. And we thank you for hearing our prayers, and we thank you for giving us your word that still speaks thousands of years after it was originally written, 3,000 years after the events that we're reading about today. And it's still relevant, it still teaches us, and we thank you for loving us enough to give it to us and for letting us learn from the lives of David and Saul and Samuel. And I pray that as we dig into this passage, I pray that you would give us clarity of thought, help us to understand what it says, and I pray that we would leave this study this morning with a clearer picture of who you are and how you want us to live. Lord, teach us now, we pray. Give us your Spirit to illumine our hearts, and I pray that we would finish this study looking more like you and loving you more. We pray these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. We're in 2 Samuel chapter 21, and as we start really today and over the next couple of weeks, as we finish out the book of 2 Samuel, we're kind of in the slideshow of the celebration of life service for King David. He's this is really kind of just some of the highlights from his life. So as we look through chapter 21, 22, 23, don't think of these events as being all in chronological order. It's kind of scattershot from different parts of his life. And it's written, it's really beautiful the way it's actually recorded in the book. It's got what's called a chiastic structure. Chiastic comes from the Greek letter chi, or what our letter X is, C-H-I. And what it means is it starts out with a national or natural disaster, and then it talks about some mighty warriors, and then kind of the highlight is a poem or a song that David wrote, and then it goes back to speaking about some mighty warriors, and then it talks about another national calamity. And that's kind of the structure of the last few chapters of 2 Samuel. Chapter 21 that we're looking at today, it can really be broken up into two sections. The first part speaks about a famine. That's the national calamity that's going on. And then the second part is talking about some mighty warriors, 4 great Israelite heroes that slew Philistine giants. And that picks up in verse 15 through the end of the chapter. Each of these sections of the chapter, they really kind of point to two sides of the same coin. The coin being that God's people are totally dependent on God. The one side of the coin is the people of God are dependent on God for his provision. And the second side of the coin, the other side, is the people of God are dependent on God for his protection or his deliverance, his salvation. So keep that in mind. And let's turn to 2 Samuel chapter 21, and we're going to read the first 14 verses about this famine. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. And David sought the face of the Lord, and the Lord said, "There is blood guilt on Saul and on his house, because he put the Gibeonites to death." So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the people of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. Although the people of Israel had sworn to spare them, Saul had sought to strike them down in his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. And David said to the Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you? And how shall I make atonement, that you may bless the heritage of the Lord?" The Gibeonites said to him, "It is not a matter of silver or gold between us and Saul or his house, neither is it for us to put any man to death in Israel." And he said, "What do you say that I shall do for you?" They said to the king, The man who consumed us and planned to destroy us so that we should have no place in all the territory of Israel, let 7 of his sons be given to us, so that we may hang them before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord. And the king said, I will give them. But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Saul's son Jonathan, because of the oath of the Lord that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. The king took 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul, Armoni and Mephibosheth, and the 5 sons of Merab, the daughter of Saul, whom she bore to Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Maholathite. And he gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them on the mountain before the Lord. And the 7 of them perished together. They were put to death in the first days of harvest at the beginning of barley harvest. Then Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock, from the beginning of harvest until rain fell upon them from the heavens. And she did not allow the birds of the air to come upon them by day, or the beasts of the field by night. When David was told what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done, David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the public square of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hanged them. On the day the Philistines killed Saul on Gilboa. And he brought up from there the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan, and they gathered the bones of those who were hanged. And they buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in the land of Benjamin in Zelah, in the tomb of Kish his father. And they did all that the king commanded, and after that God responded to the plea for the land. Well, let's get a little bit of background as to what's going on. So the first thing that we see is there's a famine in the land. And this is, I want to pause just right there because this is one of the important truths, one of those sides of the coin that we mentioned previously, that God's people are completely dependent on God for his provision. Do you remember way back, like 900 years ago, back in the book of Genesis, back in chapter 12 and in the ensuing chapters, when God called Abram to leave his home in Chaldea, modern-day Iraq, and to go to the land that God was going to show him and give to him and his offspring? Do you remember the marketing brochure for that? God was going to send him to a land that was flowing with milk and honey. And then Abram, changed his name to Abraham. Abraham passed that promise down to his son Isaac, who passed it down to his son Jacob. And then Jacob and 11 of his 12 sons all got chased out of Canaan because of a famine. The land flowing with milk and honey back in the days of Jacob had a famine, had a drought, where it didn't rain for a long time, and they had to go to Egypt and be reunited with Joseph, where there was some food that was stored up. Well, this same land, this promised land that was flowing with milk and honey, there's a famine in it. And we need to remember that when God moved Abram and his offspring to be, to the land of what we call Israel, it would be a land flowing with milk and honey for them if God's favor was upon them. In order for God's favor to be upon them, they needed to be faithful to their covenant with him. And here we open up this chapter and we read that there's yet another famine, and God's obviously displeased. And it doesn't say what did David do after 1 year of famine, after 2 years of famine. It just says that after 3 years of famine, he sought the Lord to say, hey, what's going on? So for 3 years, there's this famine in the land, and God responds. He tells them there's blood guilt. Saul broke a vow, a sacred vow with the Gibeonites. Well, we need some more background. Who are the Gibeonites? We read about them in the book of Joshua. And again, Joshua was the leader of God's people when they came out of the land of Egypt. Moses was their leader, and they wandered around the wilderness for 40 years under the leadership of Moses. And now, right as they're about to go into the promised land, the land of Canaan, Joshua is their leader. And the territory that they're in is the territory of a group of people called the Amorites. the Amorites are scattered around this region of the land of Canaan, of the Promised Land, and it had a half a dozen royal cities. Those were bigger cities where each one had its own king, its own grand poobah that was kind of in charge. And one of those cities was called Gibeon. Well, when the Gibeonites heard that Israel was coming to town, and they knew about the reputation of what happened when they came out of Egypt 40 plus years earlier, and they heard what happened to Jericho, they heard what happened to the city of Ai, they were nervous, and they said, we got to come up with a plan to make friends with the dreaded Israelites. So they put on a bunch of ratty old clothes and some worn out sandals, got some moldy bread and some burst wineskins that were old and crusty looking, and they went and met up with Joshua and some of the Israelite leaders, and they basically deceived them and said, hey, we came from a long journey and we want to be your friends. And we'll just read a verse just to kind of summarize what happened from Joshua chapter 9, verse 14. So the men took some of their provisions, so the men of Israel, the leaders of Israel, took some of these moldy provisions from these Gibeonites, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore to them. That's the covenant, that's the oath that is being referred to from 2 Samuel chapter 21 that Saul broke. The Gibeonites were deceptive. Nonetheless, Joshua, the Israelites, God, all expected Israel and subsequent generations to honor that covenant that they made with the Gibeonites, and Saul did not. Just a little more background. Gibeon was a city that was regarded as having some of the fiercest warriors of all the Amorites. And when the other 5 kings heard that Gibeon had kind of turned tail and sided with the Israelites, the other Amorite kings were upset, and they said, hey, let's go attack. And so they rallied the troops. They went to attack Gibeon, who then called on their new best friend Israel to come and rescue them. And Joshua and the Israelites showed up. And this is the battle where, if you'll recall from your Old Testament Sunday school hour, this is the battle where God caused the sun to stand still. That's Gibeon. That's who we're talking about here. And so this is about 400 years after the time of Joshua. And there's a famine in the land because God reveals it to David. Saul broke a sacred covenant between Israel and Gibeon by slaughtering maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of Gibeonites. We don't know the number, but it was a bunch. It was significant. Well, now there's a price to be paid for Saul's sin. 3 years of famine. And finally, David inquires to God, why is there a famine? God tells him. So then David goes to the Gibeonites and says, what can we do to fix this? I really want to put an end to this famine. And their response is very informative to us. First thing they said is, you know what? Money's not really going to fix this. There's no amount of silver or gold that's going to atone for what Saul did to us. And we don't really have the right just to lash out and kill the same number of Israelites that Saul killed of us. So David asks again, he said, hey, what can we do? We want to put this to rest. We want peace with you guys, and we want more than that. We want peace with the land. We want peace with God. And so the Israelites proposed a means of setting things right between them and the Israelites, between the Israelites and the Lord, and between them and the land, and the weather and their crops. But their proposal required that blood will need to be shed in order for this sin to be atoned for. A sacrifice was required. So put yourself in David's shoes as the leader of God's people. He's got the very unenviable task of picking 7 guys that are going to die, 7 offspring of King Saul. We don't know for certain if this happened before or after David's kindness to the other Mephibosheth. There's a Mephibosheth mentioned in this passage and then his friend Mephibosheth, who was the lame son of his friend Jonathan. It seems from the text that this incident here with the Gibeonites may have happened after Mephibosheth had already moved into David's court in Jerusalem. But this is a brutal job that David has, that he's got to pick 7 guys to sacrifice for the greater good, not just the good of the Gibeonites, but also for the good of Israel to put an end to this famine. I mean, can you imagine 3 years of lockdown, of shortages on toilet paper and lentils and rice and whatever else is normally in your refrigerator and your pantry and your cupboards? 3 years of this. This would be really, really tough for the country and definitely for the leader, David. One of the things, I've got a greater appreciation for people in leadership. Sometimes they've got some really tough decisions to make. David was in a tough spot. And is everybody going to agree with David in the choice he made? Well, why'd you pick those 7 and not this guy over here instead? He's a worse offspring of Saul. I don't know how many there were. I know when David was looking to find the other Mephibosheth, they said there weren't many to choose from. Not everybody's going to agree with David's decision. Some are going to ascribe an ill motive to David, that you're just doing this because it's Saul, his family. This might have been behind some of the abuse that Shimei and Sheba, who verbally and openly rebelled against David, this might have been behind their rejection of David as their king, as their leader. But we're just going to take it at face value and say that David took no pleasure in the death of these men. It seems to be a case that the king, being led by God, he came to the conclusion that the Gibeonites' idea was the best solution given the circumstances. And this sacrifice would satisfy all of the offended parties' need for justice. There's a lot for us to learn from this. I already mentioned that there's leaders sometimes are in positions where they have to make some really difficult decisions. We need to pray for our leaders of our church, leaders of our town, leaders of our state, of our nation, leaders of other nations. They've got some tough decisions to make. There's also a big lesson in here for us about reconciliation. The Gibeonites said, no amount of money will do. There's no silver or gold. And we can't kill as many people as Saul did. We can't just go straight up 1 for 1, eye for eye. That would be a slaughter. In a way, their idea of 7 men from Saul's house, it might even suggest that even though they were the offended party, they too actually wanted reconciliation. They wanted peace with the Israelites. They didn't want to just be holding a grudge forever and letting resentment fester at a national level. And it seems that they wanted that reconciliation at the lowest and but still just price that they could conceive. And I do hate, I'm kind of speaking of this like it's a business transaction, like human lives are currency. I hate to talk about it this way. I'm just not sure of a better way to talk about it. But yeah, it seems that they were offering a bargain to David and the Israelites. When we look at some of the great travesties that have taken place throughout human history, even just in the last few hundred years, we're forced to grapple with some really tough questions. What do you do with the Holocaust? What about slavery? What about the Cherokee Trail of Tears? What do you do with those? How do you compensate someone that survived a Nazi death camp and saw all the rest of their family members killed? What check can Adolf Hitler write to make up for that? And how do you satisfy the child of a slave and their right to justice without turning them into the tyrannical monster that the slave masters that they were released from were like? One thing that we see from these pagan, keep that in mind, these pagan Gibeonites, one of the things that they teach us they show us a path forward in a really, really difficult situation. It will involve a price. It will involve a sacrifice on the part of the Israelites. But it did not require a man for man, it didn't require a man for man slaughter of the Israelites. The Gibeonites, they kind of cut a bargain to David and to Israel. Hundreds, maybe thousands of Gibeonites were killed by Saul, but they only required 7 heads of Israelites as, and again, I hate to use the term, but as payment. That's the really kind of funky math of justice sometimes. Justice on the really high levels, like on the national level, oftentimes it's going to require that the offended party accept a less than fair payment. This unbalanced equation, it might remind some of you of another time when someone was sacrificed to atone for the sins of many. A few days ago, I just sat down and opened my Bible to this passage to start reading it, just as my daughter Katie walked in the room. She said, "Hey, can you read it out loud?" So I said, "Okay." So I read it, and we got done. She said something that probably has occurred to just about everybody who's read this chapter. She said, "How is that fair that those 7 guys had to die for something that Saul did?" And that is a great and very fair question. I'm not sure that I'm going to give anybody any satisfaction with what I'm about to say, but maybe I can offer a few things for us to at least chew on. One of the things that occurs to me when we look at the situation of Saul's sons and grandsons and the Gibeonites, is that at a high level, we do see justice taking place. A sacred oath was broken. The Gibeonites were slaughtered. Both God and the Gibeonites' sense of justice needed to be satisfied. But on a personal level, if you're one of the 7 men or one of the 2 mothers, this doesn't seem fair at all. In a sense, with this one scene, we've got a couple of snapshots that should help us with the big picture. On one level, no death is fair. Yes, we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God and thereby earned our fair wage of death. But our doctrine of original sin says that we were all born under a death sentence. Every single person that we know, including ourselves, is going to die because of the sin of Adam and Eve. And that's not fair. But it is the just consequence of mankind's sin. The other snapshot that I think we get from this story about Saul's offspring and the Gibeonites is that you and I, we've also broken covenant with God. We've sinned and offended the holy God of the universe, and we need a satisfactory sacrifice to make peace with him. And somehow, in God's totally unfair but oh so good divine justice, God's one and only Son, the Messiah, would die unfairly. He would pay the price for the sins of the rest of us, and somehow God's justice would be satisfied. Caiaphas, the high priest, nailed it when he said in John chapter 11, picking up in verse 49, he said to some of his little sidekicks that were talking about how this Jesus needs to be shut down or else the Romans are going to give us a hard time. Caiaphas said, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. Caiaphas hit the nail on the head. He was spot on. I don't think he had a clue what he was talking about because he was looking at a very superficial level, just the relationship of him and the Jewish leadership and the Jewish nation under the Roman Empire. And he completely missed that this was the Son of God that was going to be sacrificed, not just for the sins of the Jews, but for the entire world. But I think he was Holy Spirit inspired with what he said. And that's, I think, what John says, is that he prophesied. God revealed this to him. His words were true, even though he didn't understand what he was saying. That's my take. But Caiaphas and the Jews, they understood about substitutionary atonement. The Mosaic law prescribed it. An innocent lamb who hadn't done anything wrong would have to die for the sins of a person. That's not fair, but that's what substitutionary atonement is. And we get a picture of it here with the sons and the grandsons of Saul. The ultimate substitute was Jesus, David's descendant, who would die for sins, none of which he committed. Let's go back to the text, and let's, for a quick moment, let's just give an acknowledgement to this one poor mother, Rizpah. We see her in verse 8 and verse 10. She does something here that is, frankly, when I look at it, it just seems totally bizarre, maybe bordering on creepy, but it's a picture of just the ultimate love and faithfulness of a devastated mother. So Rizpah, she was one of Saul's concubines. 2 of her sons were of the 7 that were given over to the Gibeonites for execution. She's going to make sure, in her faithfulness to her boys, she's going to make sure that their deaths were not in vain. She grabs some potato sacks, lays them out on a rock for a bed for herself, and she takes the bodies of her sons and lays them down beside her bed. And she lays out there on this rock, on these burlap sacks, for a long time. At a minimum, it was likely weeks. And it's possible, it says in the text, that this all occurred at the beginning of barley harvest. That's typically around March, April, according to our calendar. Not really the rainy season over there. And it's possible that maybe after a few weeks, God sent rain. It's also possible that if it was just kind of following usual weather patterns, it wasn't until maybe September, October, even possibly early November before the rains came. So she may have laid out there for as much as like 6 months. We don't know for sure. But she laid out there beside the corpses of her sons on this burlap bed, and she made sure that the birds didn't come and pick at them in the day, and wild animals didn't come and pick at them at night. And she does this until the rains came. She does this until God makes good on his end of the bargain to put an end to the famine and send rain. So she lays out there, and she viewed the death of her sons really as a sacrifice on behalf of the nation. And if that's what God required to end the famine, then she waited expectantly for the rain to come. And remember, it hasn't rained in 3 years. And this may seem like kind of a hollow consolation prize, but it's not meant to be, and it's not. The response of David, when he heard about Rizpah, King David himself, he made good on a multi-generational honoring of Saul's family. A bunch of them had died, including Saul and Jonathan, his brothers. And frankly, they hadn't really been treated properly as a king, and princes should have been treated in their deaths and in the handling of their mourning and their burial. But now with Rizpah's faithfulness to her sons, King David has the bones of Saul and Jonathan and the rest of these 7 men. He has them all returned to their hometown for a proper burial in their own family tomb. So Rizpah, in her faithfulness to her sons, she actually brought honor to her sons and to the whole household of Saul. And then the real happy ending to the story is that the Lord put an end to the famine. And Israel, again, was in right standing with God and could enjoy his blessings and his provision. Well, let's jump down to verse 15, and we'll look at the second part of this chapter. This is speaking about 4 mighty warriors. I'll read the first one, about the first warrior, starting in verse 15. There was war again between the Philistines and Israel. And David went down together with his servants, and they fought against the Philistines. And David grew weary. And Ishbi-benob, one of the descendants of the giants, whose spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze, and who was armed with a new sword, thought to kill David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to his aid and attacked the Philistine and killed him. Then David's men swore to him, "You shall no longer go out with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel." We're going to come back and speak about the Philistines really for the bulk of the rest of our time. But let me mention here, Abishai, we've seen him before. He was the guy who, he was the anti-hero in last week's chapter 20. Abishai's the guy that offered to go and chop off the head of Shimei when he was throwing dust and rocks and cursing David. He was the guy that was whispering in David's ear back in 1 Samuel when they went into the camp of Saul at night, and there's Saul asleep on the ground. He said, "Hey, let me just take one shot at him with my spear. I won't need a second one, and I'm going to kill him." That's Abishai. He gets a mention here in kind of David's Hall of Fame. And remember, we mentioned this was a slideshow. Abishai deserves a slide in David's celebration of life ceremony. He saved the king's life. He's a legit hero here. David is in battle with the Philistines, and one of these giants, his name's Ishbi-benob. He's probably bitter because his parents named him Ishbi-benob. He's about to kill the king. And right as he's closing in, David's tired. He's probably been battling for minutes, hours, maybe all day. And this giant closes in on him, and Abishai comes on the scene and strikes the giant dead. He's a hero. Well, now, the generals, the leaders of Israel, have a conversation with David. So, David, you're kind of losing your fastball a little bit. We can't afford to lose you in battle. So you need to stay home. We'll go out and we're going to fight the battles. You've been a great warrior, but we can't have you on the front lines anymore and risking losing you. This might have been, I don't know, this might have been the reason why when we read back in the account of David and Bathsheba, you remember it said when kings go off to war, and David was home and he was up on his roof, and he unfortunately looked out and saw Bathsheba down below taking a bath. This might be why. We don't know, but for some reason back then with Bathsheba, he wasn't off in battle. And we do read here that at some point in his career as king, the Israelites said, we can't afford to lose you, so you stay home. There's 3 more mighty warriors of Israel that struck down giants. I'll just summarize with verse 22 of the chapter. These 4 were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. There's 2 others. One of them's one of the great Philistine mathematicians. He's got 24 fingers and toes, tough to buy gloves for. He was one of the giants that was struck down. Another one was struck down by a guy named Elhanan. Some people think that name, Elhanan, some people think that was just another name for David. It might have been. There's some debate about who that was because he killed a guy named Goliath. Goliath might have been a family name that this Goliath was the cousin or the brother of the Goliath that we read about back in 1 Samuel chapter 17. We don't know, but there were 3 men in addition to Abishai who struck down giants of Philistines. And I really kind of want to use that as a jumping off point for us because a huge chunk of these men's stories involve the Philistines. And really the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, it tells the stories of 3 great leaders of Israel. The last judge, Samuel, the first king, Saul, and then the favorite king, David. And the Philistines, they're like the Lex Luthor of the Israelites. They're the Ulysses Claw to the Israelites as we go through the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And you remember that at the time of David, we're about, give or take, 500 years after Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. Joshua led them into the promised land, and then when Joshua died, the Israelites entered into a period that we know as the Judges. And it was a period marked by everybody, God's children. Everybody did what seemed right in their own eyes, with total disregard to what God said, what God commanded, what God expected. They just did whatever felt good to them, whatever they wanted. And it was a period that was marked by this vicious cycle of everything's going good, and then the people would fall into horrible idolatry. Then God would chasten them by sending one of their neighbors, one of these ites from the land of Canaan, the Canaanites, to punish them. Then there would be a period of repentance and crying out to God for deliverance. And then God would send a deliverer, a judge, and they would have a little bit of rest for a while. And then they would fall back into sinful idolatry again and restart the cycle. When we come into the book of 1 Samuel, we're still in the period of the judges. Samuel is the last judge of Israel. And so he lives during this time when this vicious cycle is going on. And when we get to 1 Samuel, we get to chapter 4. And I said this, I actually taught chapter 4 last summer. And I mentioned at the time that the Philistines, you can almost see the Philistines as a theme of the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. That would probably get me kicked out of most seminaries in the country. But they're mentioned so often. They're really kind of the contrast to God's people, the Israelites. They serve as a measuring stick in determining God's favor on his people. Specifically, the Philistines, they really kind of serve as a thermometer measuring God's favor with his anointed king, Saul, then David. And so ultimately, 1st and 2nd Samuel, it's the story of God working amongst his people. And two of the leading actors in the story are the kings, Saul and David. And both kings would have numerous encounters with the dreaded Philistines. One king, Saul, he would have a little success with them, but he'd have a lot more heartburn from the Philistines, and ultimately he wouldn't look all that great when the Philistines come on the scenes, and eventually he would die in a battle with the Philistines. The other king, David, he'd become famous on the backs of the Philistines. He would have a fame that would transcend generations so that even 3,000 years later, people are still naming their sons after him because of his heroic exploits in battles with the Philistines. So I want to spend the rest of our time just kind of focused on the Philistines in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And I'm going to fly through this. We're not going to have time to dig into every passage, but I just want to fly through it because that's what chapter 21 of 2 Samuel is doing when it mentions these four warriors who defeated Philistine giants. That's one of the main points of all of 1st and 2nd Samuel, is that the little guy slays the giants because God's on his side. So we come to 1 Samuel. We get to chapter 4 when Samuel's a boy. Somebody's reintroduced. The Philistines. We haven't seen the Philistines since the days of Samson. I don't know where that was chronologically, but it's been a while. And then they come back on the scene, and Israel still, in this period of the judges, they're still haunted by the Philistines. They won't leave them alone. They just keep coming back and rearing their ugly head decade after decade. In chapter 4, Eli died, his sons died, 30,000 Israelites died in battle with the Philistines, and the Ark of God was captured by the Philistines. Israel needed to be rescued from the dreaded Philistines. That's one of the common markers in this whole book is the Philistines on the scene. Then we get to 1 Samuel chapter 7. And Samuel's now an adult, and he brings victory against the Philistines. And then let's fast forward. Saul's become king. We get to chapter 13. I'm going to read a couple of snippets here from 1 Samuel 13. Saul's king. Verse 3 of 1 Samuel 13 says, Jonathan defeated the garrison of the Philistines that was at Geba. And now I'm going to fast forward down to verse 6. When the Philistines now, they've come up for battle after what Jonathan did to them. Verse 6, when the men of Israel saw that they were in trouble, for the people were hard pressed, the people, look at this, the people hid themselves in caves and in holes and in rocks and in tombs and in cisterns. And some Hebrews crossed the fords of the Jordan to the land of Gad in Gilead. Saul was still at Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. All right, we're going to give Saul credit for that victory. But how good do you feel when you read that? I mean, here we've got in the same paragraph, we've got Saul being mentioned and the Philistines being mentioned. Jonathan won a battle. That's fantastic. Check one for Saul. He was the king. He gets credit. But really, do you come away from that passage with this great feeling about Saul's leadership? It doesn't say that he was trembling. He was the leader of a whole bunch of people that were just hiding out in holes, in wells, and tombs. They were finding any place to hide from the Philistines. Not a bunch of brave warriors. And Saul's their leader. It's not a great look for the king, the military leader of the people. You jump down to chapter 14, verse 13. Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet, and his armor bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer killed them after him. They killed about 20 men that day. Again, Jonathan, Saul's son, so this is Saul gets credit for the victory, but it was kind of Jonathan that did it. He killed 20. We kind of have a little hiatus there for a couple of chapters in the book of 1 Samuel. Actually, I'm sorry, before I even say that, the tail end of chapter 14, that's probably the best resume of Saul as far as his military leadership is concerned. It says in chapter 14, verse 47, when Saul had taken the kingship over Israel, he fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the Ammonites, against Edom, against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he routed them. And so he had some success against all their enemies, including the Philistines, but we don't get a lot of detail about it. And when we do get detail about Saul and the Philistines, it's not great. It's he's with a bunch of cowards that are hiding in tombs and in holes in the ground. And then we come to chapter 15, and God rejects Saul as king. In chapter 16, God chooses another king and anoints him, David. And then we get to 17. And this is the one where David gets famous. David's put on the map. Let me read a couple of verses. I'm going to skip around here. 1 Samuel 17. Now the Philistines, there they are again. They're on the scene. Gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah and Ephesh Damim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered. So we've got the Philistines being mentioned and Saul's mentioned. Saul and the Israelites gathered, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. Fast forward, verse 4. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits in a span. He's humongous. And then skip down to verse 10. And the Philistines said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. Verse 11. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. This should be obvious. How is Saul portrayed now that God has rejected him as king? Now that he's faced with a powerful enemy? He's scared. Saul's not acting like the great leader that he's supposed to be. He's hiding behind a rock. He's supposed to be leading his people. He's supposed to be, he's responsible for protecting his people from their enemies. And instead, he's terrified. For 40 days, the Philistine giant came out and said, send me somebody to fight and we can end this thing. And for 40 days, morning and evening, that's 80 times, Saul was reminded in front of the entire army of his cowardice. And he was so, think about what it would take to do what he did when David, this like 94-pound junior high pipsqueak sheep herder, shows up and says, I'll fight him. Saul actually thought that was a good idea. Knowing what the consequences were, he thought, okay, David, yeah, you go get him. Saul's like probably, 6'5", and he's 2 feet taller than David. He's like, yeah, little guy, you go fight the giant. He thought that was a good idea. Even Goliath, when David walked out, he's looking at him and going, are you like really far away? Why do you look so small? Nobody thought that was a good idea. But I think Saul's thinking was so mixed up at this point in his cowardice that he thought, sure, we'll send David out. Saul did not look good anytime the Philistines were on the scene. But then David, God's other anointed, God uses the Philistines to highlight David's faith, to highlight David's courage and his valor. 1 Samuel 18, just as one summary verse, verse 30 says, Then the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. David batted 1,000 against the Philistines. He never lost a battle. And he became famous. They wrote a song about him. When David was on the run from Saul, he found refuge in Philistine territory, and not just anywhere in the Philistine territory, but in the city of Gath, where David was from, the one that made him famous because he killed him. He went there and found refuge. And that same king, King Achish of the Philistine city of Gath, when David had agreed to, he gave him refuge for a couple of years. And when the Philistines went out to battle against the Israelites, David said, okay, I'll fight on your side, Philistines and Achish, against my own people, Israel. Achish sent him off with his blessing. He even referred to him as an angel of God. That's the picture that we get as we read through, particularly 1 Samuel, of what it looks like when the leader of God's people has God's favor resting on him. When the leader has been rejected by God, he looks scared like Saul. When the leader has God's favor, even though he's tiny and doesn't even shave yet, he can slay giants. And even the relationships with his enemies, like King Achish, can be such that the king of his enemies calls him an angel of God. That's kind of the point of the story of the kings of Israel and the Philistines. Ultimately, God used the littleness of David juxtaposed with the bigness of the Philistines to highlight his power and his provision for his people. The story of David and Goliath and of Israel and Egypt and the Canaanites and the Philistines, they're not stories of long odds. They're stories of impossible odds. None of this should have been possible. There was no way that Moses would lead Israel out of Egypt. There's no way that David would defeat the Philistine Goliath. There's no way that these vagabonds, Israelites, would enter the land of Canaan and defeat the Amorites and the Philistines. And David's mighty men, they had no business taking on those 4 Philistine giants. So what's the point of this story and all these stories? They're all pictures for us. You and I, we've got a big, fat giant that threatens our souls. It's our sin. It's the consequence of our sin. It's the devil. It's hell. It's separation from God. We have no way of dealing with that ourselves. There's no possible way that we can win this battle and defeat our giant. We need someone bigger, stronger, more righteous than us, perfect. We need that person to fight the battle on our behalf. The Philistines and their giants were the murderous enemies of God's people who continually threatened their very existence. David, God's anointed, was 100% successful year after year in defeating the Philistines and bringing salvation to God's people. And David, God's anointed, the deliverer of God's people, he was a snapshot of the one true Messiah who would come and ultimately deliver God's people from their biggest and worst enemy, death. Let me close by reading this. This is God through Moses to his people from Deuteronomy chapter 20. When you go out to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army larger than your own, you shall not be afraid of them, for Yahweh your God is with you, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And when you draw near to the battle, the priest shall come forward and speak to the people, and shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, today you are drawing near for battle against your enemies. Let not your heart faint. Do not fear or panic or be in dread of them. For Yahweh your God is he who gives you the fight. For Yahweh your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to give you the victory. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he cause his face shine upon you, and may he fill you with his peace. God bless all of you.